Normally, when the Democrats in Congress want to pass a bill to give themselves political cover so they can pretend not to be doing the thing everybody knows they're doing, fig leaf bills, I like to call them, they usually don't have much trouble getting a sufficient number of useless idiot Republicans to go along with it. And in extreme cases, they might have a useful idiot Republican actually draw up the legislation, as they did with this ridiculous monstrosity of a fake border security bill that just went down to crushing defeat this week, which was written by Mitch McConnell and crying Chuck Schumer. Then McConnell handed it off to Jim Lankford of Oklahoma and told him to go put the lipstick on the pig, and the way it was supposed to work was they'd try to jam the thing through and get it to a floor vote as quickly as possible, hopefully before too many Republicans had bothered actually reading the damn thing, and they would peel off just enough lazy, useful, idiot Republicans to get the thing passed and send it to the House, and then all the Democrats could run to CNN and say, "Hooray! We got a bipartisan border security bill!" Because while they don't love bipartisanship, they actually hate it quite passionately. They do love the appearance of bipartisanship. They love being able to say the word bipartisanship. And normally, there are enough idiot Republicans who haven't read the bill that they are able to do just that. Now, it goes without saying that to call this a border security bill is rather like calling vodka the cure for alcoholism. In point of fact, this was an open borders/Ukraine aid bill that did nothing to enhance border enforcement, that provided $16 billion to add personnel to the illegal alien concierge service we used to call the Border Patrol, so that they could more effectively process border jumpers and send them on their way into the interior of the country, while over 2.5 times that amount, $60 billion to be exact, would have gone to Muscle Shirt Jesus and the Ukes. It also, amazingly, would have actually legalized illegal border crossing, up to a certain number of crossings per day. But the plan got foiled when, for once, most of the Republicans in the Senate actually read the bill and figured out what a big steaming pile of legislative dog shit it was. Now look, I know legislators love to legislate. When you're a professional legislator, there really isn't much you can do except run your mouth on television and pass new laws. And for around 2/3 of the Republicans in the Senate, I do believe they actually want to stop the illegal alien invasion that has been unleashed and facilitated by Biden and the enemy saboteur Mayorkas. And I know there are a lot of Americans posing the question, and you've heard me pose it so many times I probably sound like a broken record by now. Why are people who sneak into our country in contravention of our laws still allowed to claim refugee and asylum seeker status? That's a hell of a good question, but there isn't one single Republican in either house of Congress who seems interested in asking it. And so, as it often does, the task falls to people like yours truly. And I hold the answer here in my formerly nicotine-stained fingers. The Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966, passed by the 89th Congress, signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson on 2 December 1966. For its intended purpose, it was a pretty straightforward law that was supported by sizable majorities on both sides of the aisle. The problem was that up until the passage of this law, all asylum claims had to be made at official ports of entry. And obviously, Cuban dissidents who were fleeing from communist tyranny in homemade improvised rafts, they didn't really have the option of presenting themselves at an official port of entry. And so, this law stipulated that asylum and refugee claims could be registered by anyone who was currently in U.S. territory, up to and including the territorial waters around the Florida Peninsula. In 1995, President Clinton amended the statute by executive order, which presidents are allowed to do, so long as the courts find that the addendum is compatible with the spirit and the letter of the original law, which stated that prospective refugees and asylees had to set one foot on U.S. soil in order to have their claim registered. Otherwise, they would be returned to their country of origin. They called it the wet foot, dry foot policy. Dry foot, you get to register your claim. Wet foot, you get sent back to Cuba. The problem was that Cuban boat people would make it into U.S. territorial waters, and then they would sit there and wait to be rescued by the Coast Guard, which we were then required to do under the terms of our own statute. And this created a lot of hazardous situations, both for the Cubans themselves and for the American personnel who were required to go and render them aid. So the wet foot, dry foot policy stipulated that, nah, guys, you've got to do the work yourselves and row all the way to the coast. No more free trips from the Coast Guard. And the wet foot, dry foot policy remained in place until President Barack Obama rescinded it in January of 2017, on his very last full day in office. Could there possibly be some sort of ulterior motive at play here, I wonder? Now, everybody understood when this law was passed back in '66 that it was only supposed to apply to Cuban dissidents and refugees escaping by boat and by raft, but nobody thought to write it into the wording of the statute that it only applies to the southern coast of Florida. And so when they got into office in early 2021, Biden and the enemy saboteur Mayorkas, who would have been intimately familiar with this law, being himself the offspring of Cuban immigrants, they said, you know what? That's a nice big loophole they left in the wording of this law. What say we drive a Mack truck through it? And boy, did they. Fleets of Mack trucks, in fact, one after the other, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for upwards of 3 years in a row now. And with the wet foot, dry foot policy having been conveniently wiped off the books, that means for illegal aliens crossing into Texas, they only have to make it to the U.S. side of the Rio Grande and shout out the magic words, and they've won the fucking lottery. Welcome to America. Please feel free to suckle from the teat of the welfare state for the rest of your natural-born life. So in literal technical terms, it's not even correct to say the opening of the border by Biden and the enemy saboteur Mayorkas is a lawless act. Is it underhanded? Sure. Dishonest? Sure. Destructive to the country and its people? Sure. But the actual blame lies with the 89th Congress for not putting more rigid stipulations in the original act 58 years ago. The amazing thing really is that it took the Democrats this long to start exploiting the loophole. You want to talk about root causes of the border crisis? There it is. You want to talk about legislative solutions? There it is. The Republicans had 2 full years between 2017 and 2019 when they controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency. They easily could have repealed the Cuban Adjustment Act and denied the ability of a future Democrat president to do the exact thing that is being done right now. And right up to the present day, how many times have we heard Republicans even broach the subject? Well, that's a big fat 0, ladies and gentlemen. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we will be glad to hear your asylum claim if you can get past the alligators in the moat. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I'm your eponymous host and humble servant. And we need to talk about the president, folks. The old man is basically crumbling into dust right before our eyes. Even 4 years ago, when he first announced he was running for the presidency, it was obvious to anybody with functioning eyes and ears that the only place this guy belongs is in a goddamn nursing home. In 2020, we saw the first back porch campaign since William McKinley in 1896, and that's because it was the only type of campaign Joe Biden was in any sort of condition to run. Most days he would shuffle out to the front yard for 5 or 10 minutes of press availability, then he would go back inside to the basement, spend another hour or 2 appearing on Zoom calls and podcasts and whatnot, telling black guys they ain't black. And then the campaign would call a lid, and that would be the extent of Joe's workday. And since it was 2020, his handlers were able to blame it all on the China virus, rather than on their candidate's obviously mentally enfeebled condition. But fast forward to today, and 2024 Joe Biden makes 2020 Joe Biden look like an energetic, razor-sharp man of action by comparison. The decline is quite a shocking thing to behold, really, and it seems to get drastically worse with each passing day and week, and his handlers, they know that all too well. It's not unusual that 2 or 3 days will go by with the president simply disappearing from public view, and nobody will say where he is or what he might be doing. All we get are half-hearted assurances from John Kirby and Baghdad Buckwheat that, the president is working so hard, talking to so many world leaders, he just doesn't have the time to appear in public. But he is so energetic, I can barely keep up with him. Now, does anybody actually believe that? Of course they don't. The American people, the ones who are paying attention at any rate, they can see perfectly well that Biden is incapable of taking questions from the press, He's incapable of walking up the airplane stairs or making his way across a stage without falling on his ass. He can no longer even read prepared remarks from a teleprompter where the letters are about 6 freaking inches tall. Which is to say, if 2020-era Joe Biden should have been in a nursing home, then 2024-era Joe Biden, he should have long since been moved into the memory care ward, because let's call things what they are. This is a man who requires round-the-clock care. When you look at Joe Biden in his current state, can you picture him tying his own shoes, or feeding himself, or wiping his own backside without assistance? Me either. This is a man in a very advanced state of dementia. There is no other way of putting it, and we are still 10 months away from the election. But don't take my word for any of this. There are a couple of shockingly disastrous pieces of video just from the last 48 hours that tell the story better than this reporter ever could. And if you haven't seen the clips, you really need to. So let's watch together.
There is some movement, and I don't want to, well, maybe choose my words.
He's not choosing his words. His mind has gone blank, and he has no idea what he was just talking about. That's what's happening here.
There's some movement. There's been a response from the opposition.
And what's happening here is that he has completely forgotten the name of Hamas. You know, Israel's adversary that they are fighting a war. The thing he was just in the middle of talking about. A 5-letter, 2-syllable word that is escaping him completely.
But, yes, I'm sorry, from Hamas.
Now, what you just saw happen there was a friendly reporter had to come to his rescue and go, Hamas. Otherwise, he was going to stand there fumbling and stumbling and mumbling for, who knows, maybe the rest of the afternoon.
But it seems to be a little over the top. We're not sure where it is. There's a continuing negotiation. I went to what they call a G7 meeting, all the NATO leaders. And it was in the south of England. And I sat down and I said, America's back. And Mitterrand from France looked at me and said, you know, why, how long are you back for? And I looked at him, and the Chancellor of Germany said, what would you say, Mr. President, if you picked up the paper tomorrow in the London Times, and the London Times said, 1,000 people break through the House of Commons, break down the doors, 2 bobbies are killed in order to stop the election of the Prime Minister. What would you say?
And that's actually not even the worst of it. Apparently the White House has memory hold the third bit of video that I wanted to play where Biden actually confuses Angela Merkel with Helmut Kohl, which I guess is an easy enough mistake, except that Helmut Kohl is not a woman, hasn't been the German Chancellor since 1998, and died 7 years ago. You may have also read the news earlier today that the special counsel in the Biden classified documents case, Robert Hur, has submitted his final report in which he said he doesn't intend to file any criminal charges. Not because there was no criminal conduct on Biden's part, but because he is so mentally enfeebled that the special counsel doesn't think he could get a jury to convict him because he is so far gone in the head as to be incapable of criminal intent. And these quotes from the report, they are just about as damning a condemnation of a president's mental fitness as I think one could possibly envisage. Quote, our investigation uncovered evidence that President Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen. End quote. It goes on to say, quote, we have also considered that at trial, Mr. Biden would likely present himself to a jury, as he did during our interview of him, as a sympathetic, well-meaning, elderly man with a poor memory. Based on our direct interactions with and observations of him, he is someone for whom many jurors will want to identify reasonable doubt. It would be difficult to convince a jury that they should convict him, by then a former president well into his 80s, of a serious felony that requires a mental state of willfulness. End quote. Picking up in the next paragraph, quote, Mr. Biden's memory also appeared to have significant limitations. he did not remember, even within several years, when his son Beau died. In his interview with our office, he did not remember when he was vice president, forgetting on the first day of the interview when his term ended. If it was 2013, when did I stop being vice president? And forgetting on the second day of the interview when his term began. In 2009, am I still vice president? Among the places Mr. Biden's lawyers found classified documents in the garage was a damaged, opened box containing numerous hanging folders, file folders, and binders. The box was in a mangled state. End quote. Yeah, I think there are quite a few things in a mangled state here, frankly. And consider that tens of millions of your countrymen are going to go to the polls in November and happily vote to return this man to office for a second term that will end when he is 87 years old. And I don't have the faintest idea what the Democrats are going to do here. They had a few different options for moving him aside, but they needed to put those plans in motion like a year ago, at least. I even drew them a roadmap for how they should go about it. The Supreme Court vacancy, that was a perfect opportunity to get Kamala Harris the hell out of the way while pretending to give her a promotion, because you know how it is, you have to fail upward. Then they could have slid Hillary Clinton right into the vice presidency and then figured out a way to force Joe to resign. And yeah, I know that she already lost to Trump once, but take a look at the Democrat bench. She is still the best conceivable option they've got, and they don't have it anymore. And I know there's a lot of people out there who think they will just wait until the convention and then swap Biden out for somebody else, which they could have done if we were in 1960 and the primaries weren't yet binding, but we ain't in 1960. The primaries are binding now. Delegates are being pledged that can't be unpledged so long as Biden remains alive. So this is your candidate, Democrats. The guy who can't give a 5-minute speech. The guy who can't remember what decade he's in. The guy who has at least half a dozen different versions of where, when, and how his son died. The guy who can no longer distinguish from his own personal recollections and scenes from movies he likes. And there's absolutely no way in hell you can put this guy on the debate stage against Donald Trump. Can you even imagine how that would go? And there ain't no China virus this year, knock on wood. That's going to enable him to change all the voting laws and shotgun blast unsolicited mail ballots out to every registered voter, living and preferably dead. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure Joe's going to carry 100% of the vote from the Civil War veterans just like he did last time, but even with all the shenanigans they had to get up to in 2020 in order to drag his half-dead ass across the finish line, the peculiar exigencies of that election, they were a one-time thing. And sure, you've still got the whole legacy news media firmly in the tank, but how much credibility do those guys have left at this point when they already mortgaged most or all of it in their desperately maniacal attempts to help defeat Trump in the last 2 elections? Anyway, best of luck, Democrats. Can't wait to see how it turns out for you. Thanks very much indeed for watching. See you Sunday, Blast Radius, 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific. I think there's some sort of big sporting competition going on that same day, but who gives a damn? You should watch something edifying instead. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.